Hi, folks. Welcome to our next film, Hiroshima, Mon Amour. This is the first film that we're going to watch in this time period called the French New Wave. And this is a really important time period for this class. Several of the films we're going to watch are from this exact same period and were made just in a 2-year span. 4 of these films we're going to see, Hiroshima, Mon Amour, as well as Pickpocket, Breathless, and Cleo from 5 to 7. What's cool about this time period is this was a major innovation in filmmaking in France. So before this era, French cinema was really dreadful, and it was characterized by expensive, lavish studio productions that had really cliched scripts, weren't very interesting, and the whole industry sort of stalled out and had this period of crisis. And then a whole new wave of young filmmakers totally broke all the previous conventions, started making movies in a totally new way, and that's what's called the French New Wave. So, for example, these films have much more interesting scripts that deal with more interesting storylines. They have a totally different approach to set design and realism. Many of the French New Wave films were shot on location with low budgets. So you'll see that this film, Hiroshima, Mon Amour, was not just made in a studio. They went out into the world and started filming real locations, and it gives the filmmaking just a whole new level of depth. Totally different editing and sound techniques were explored in this period. So this is really one of the most famous and innovative periods in all of cinema history. And what's great is it's also philosophically innovative. So the same time period in French history was the exact same time period as the famous French existentialism. So Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre, and Camus were all writing at this exact same time, and they were actually interacting with these very same screenwriters and filmmakers. So this period explores exciting film and existentialism simultaneously. Hiroshima Mon Amour is one of the very first films, 1959, from this period, and it's also just a fantastic movie. It was directed by Alain Resnais, and it was written by Marguerite Duras, and she wrote, I think, an absolutely amazing screenplay. So much of what is philosophically deep about this film is in the script. It's really wonderful. The screenplay is published, and I highly recommend checking it out. It's just a really awesome script. I think the rest of the film, though, the direction, the formal features, this is almost a perfect movie, in my opinion. Everything, the soundtrack, the editing, the mise en scène works so brilliantly to reinforce the philosophical message. What's cool is there's so few characters as well. This is what you can do with a small budget film, where you don't have to like have a bunch of CGI animation or a huge studio production paying tons and tons of a huge cast and crew. You can just make a film with a couple of dialogue parts. There's hardly any speaking characters in this movie. So let's just talk about the two most important ones. They don't even have names. So there's the man who's oftentimes just called Hiroshima, or the man who's sort of symbolically connected to Hiroshima in Japan, and the woman from France who is sometimes just called Nevers in the film, the city where she's from. So Hiroshima and Nevers is how I will refer to them. The first thing I want to explore in this video is how do you characterize the woman from Nevers? What do you think her existential situation is? Is she in despair? Is she living authentically? How would Kierkegaard talk about her? So use the tools and concepts you've learned so far. Pause your videos. I really want you to think about this. I want you to list some evidence. Try to make sense of the film before you just listen to me talk about it. Okay, that was your last chance to pause your videos. Let's start talking about her existential situation. So the first thing is, there's an amazing way in which, this film is so symbolically deep. Let's think about the symbolism behind nuclear destruction and the destruction of Hiroshima. The first thing I want you to think about is how the film reinforces the concept that destruction is a metaphor for her destruction and her loss. So there's the destruction of Hiroshima at the beginning of the film is intercut with their two bodies in this amorous embrace. And what's interesting, there's many levels to this. For one thing, you can see ash sort of rains down on them in their bodies, and that's connected with the ash shown in the pictures of the nuclear devastation. So there's a really, really clear connection made between them. This might have seemed completely mysterious to you at first, though. Like, why? So these bodies are in sweaty embrace. This shows like a kind of passion. So there's a passionate connection between the two of them. But it also, think about the mise en scène here, the way in which this is shot really in close up, so that the bodies are almost twisted and whatnot. We can't quite totally make sense of it. It requires effort on behalf of the viewers. But so the twisting makes it difficult to interpret the scene. Eventually, we can piece it together, but that's also symbolic of the way in which we must piece together our understanding of her entire life and her current existential position. But the close-up framing of it also makes the bodies seem sort of twisted, like the bodies we see post nuclear devastation, when we see the twisted bodies and corpses from the bombing of Hiroshima. So there's it's amazing how just the framing and the opening sequence, with almost no dialogue, or with very sparse dialogue, really sets up some of the deepest aspects and thoughts in the movie. Now, here's another interesting connection between her and the nuclear devastation. There's this discussion with some of the audio track, the dialogue track over it now, about how the survivors adapted to life after nuclear devastation. And we don't get this right away, but if you think about it later on, it's absolutely ingenious how this foreshadows her own devastation, and the way in which they adapt. Actually, there's all these thematic connections. I mean, here's one. It talks about the hair loss of the individuals from the nuclear radiation, and these pictures of their hair loss. And remember, when she goes down into the cellar, she has all of her hair cut off, and it's shown in a pile. So this hair loss of the folks, post-nuclear devastation in Hiroshima, it perfectly parallels or sets up her devastation, and gives a kind of symbolic meaning. I mean, the significance of this, as I read it, is the devastation of the death of the German soldier to her in her personal life was basically it was a nuclear destruction. That was what the death of him meant to her. That's the way in which I interpret all of this sort of subtle metaphorical setup, because we get all this stuff and this connection set up far before we understand what's going on in her story. And in fact, the mysteriousness of her is set up in the dialogue track when they're talking about how they don't really understand each other. Lack of understanding, this key Kierkegaardian theme, is comes up over and over again throughout this movie. Now let's think about her loss. In order to do that, we have to understand the German soldier. So let's consider that his character. He's only told in flashback, but we get these sort of idyllic, fun, happy soundtrack, the romance, the excitement of it through these flashbacks, and her love with the German soldier. The film also really foregrounds the fact that there's a deep ethical norm that she is violating by engaging in this. So this is a story of forbidden romance. The Germans were the occupiers, and everybody loyal to France detested the Vichy government that was collaborators with the Germans, were morally detested. They were, and as we see, as soon as the war ends, they were ostracized and punished. So throughout this, even despite the fact that we could easily see her as a detestable character, we see that even through the ravages of war, two people could have a deep connection. Her German soldier is not portrayed. We don't know enough about him, but he's not portrayed as a moral monster, as Nazis are oftentimes portrayed in the film. So perhaps there is something deep and authentic to their romance and their relationship, because it's portrayed in a sympathetic light. We don't see him walking around doing all the horrible things that are associated with the German forces and the Secret Service and whatnot. So I think the film invites us to view him as an individual in a way that doesn't just have him portrayed as sort of the cliched Nazi that you often see in film. In many ways, her identity is completely wrapped up in this romance, in the same way I think in which Kierkegaard talks about romantic love as being potentially identity defining as a source of ultimate commitment for an individual. I mean, for example, she talks about her future life with him, how they were going to leave together. So I think again, this feeds into the positive portrayal of the German soldier, and how, you know, she couldn't really, even after he was dead and she was hugging him, she couldn't even tell the difference between his body and her own. I think, I mean, this is incredibly symbol laden and meaningful. Her whole identity, she can't even separate them in her mind even after he's gone. Also think about the fact that throughout this movie she has a kind of uh, a grim attitude. She is not, you know, she's not fully embracing life in a lighthearted way. That's impossible for her. And I think we see that once we come to understand her backstory, as the past is still haunting her. It's ever present in her. And this is a theme. I think this reinforces the fact that this romantic love with the German soldier was completely identity defining. It was a all encompassing unconditional commitment in Kierkegaard's sense, by the fact, even in her job, that she's an actress. And what she does is she reenacts films, uh, historical pieces. So she is literally living in the past for a living. And we see, like, look at the mise en scène on this shot. It's almost highly expressivist filmmaking, where this person, this Japanese actor, it's almost like he is a ghost. Like, literally, the ghosts of the past are surrounding her and haunting her, even as she is. So and look at her gaze is off here. Her gaze is, look at the man from Japan, Hiroshima. His gaze, look at his eye line on her, and her gaze is completely over here. She is stuck in the past and haunted by it, whereas he is trying to make a meaningful connection, and he is absorbed in the present and her. Um, so just the fact that she is completely living in the past is reinforced on so many interesting levels throughout the film. Uh, okay, let me give you one last bit that reinforces this again, and this is in the dialogue track where she's talking about how this lack of knowledge, and how she says that the man from Hiroshima doesn't know her and doesn't understand her. The way I read this is, the reason he doesn't is because he doesn't know her backstory yet. In order to actually understand her, you have to understand her past relationship and how it was defined by the love of this German soldier. Even now, she can't get it out of her head. It's impossible. She is reliving it all the time. That is, and this relationship that she sparks up with the man from Hiroshima, in a sense, brings all those painful memories back to the fore in some ways. So in order for him to understand her, he has to come to understand that backstory. And he starts to throughout the film. And that's why there is so much depth and character arc and tension and excitement by the climax of the film. It might seem like a really slow movie to you, but there's ways in which, existentially speaking, things are on a razor edge. There's all sorts of existential excitement here. So we'll talk about what happens in the end of the film. Okay, and one last point. I mean, when they talk to each other, then, and he just calls her Nevers and she calls him Hiroshima, they symbolically, they're like metonyms for their cities in an interesting way, and that means she, as Nevers, is literally her identity, her name and her identity are identified with the city of her past, which is stuck in time. If you remember it from those flashbacks, Nevers is shown in this dead, frozen in time moment in a lot of those shots. So she is identified sort of in her very name with this city from her past. Now let's think about just another thematic connection that I think is really important for understanding her as a character, as well as the man from Japan, is the way in which this relationship with the man from Japan is juxtaposed in ways it's compared and contrasted with her past relationship with the man from Germany. I mean, I think the movie really invites us to think about this comparison, and this is just how beautiful the screenplay is, in my opinion. How how this juxtaposition of of the Axis powers, you know, Japan and Germany being the Axis powers from World War II, she is now reprising the relationship of of uh, of love of the enemy by having this romantic relationship with the man from Japan. It's like now, you know, there's a clear way in which Japan and Germany, because of the history of World War II, are symbolically connected. And so again, she is in a norm violating relationship with one of the enemy powers. Now it's just the Japanese enemy power, but this still violates ethical norms. You might say, okay, 20 years later, it's not like relationships are so forbidden. But remember, she has a husband and children now back in France. So she is clearly violating ethical norms still. And this relationship has a whole new meaning because of that. But think how little she dwells on her current husband and children. Her love of her husband, if there is any, is not what's brought forward. You know, imagine somebody having an affair like this when they're off in a foreign country. You would think they would feel guilt and be thinking about their current, you know, their current spouse. But she is not full of guilt by thinking about her current spouse. It's, in a sense, she's full of guilt thinking about cheating on her German soldier. That is the relationship which is ever present in her mind when she's with the man from Hiroshima, not her current relationship with whoever it is back in France. So that's what reinforces so much this connection between the German soldier and the man from Hiroshima. There's also ways in which the two cities of Hiroshima and Nevers in France are compared and juxtaposed. We have so many interesting tracking shots moving through both cities. The two cities almost are characters. There are so few human characters. There's so few stars in the film, like human characters who have repeated lines of dialogue. I mean, besides these two people, everybody else who has a line of dialogue is almost just like an extra. And some of those folks are non-actors. They're just other people in the film who just have one line here or there. But after the man and the woman, the two biggest characters in the film are the cities of Hiroshima and the city of Nevers, really. And so we see this connection between the man and her relationship with the German soldier in Nevers, and how that is symbolically connected with death over and over again. So it's frozen in time almost in these shots. And notice like the way in which this shot is showing like a sign which is gone, and there's no modern electricity. This is not like a living city. Whereas these shots from Hiroshima have the neon and have this living, there's people moving around in these shots. So the two cities are really shown as similarities, but also shown for how deeply different they are. Okay, so what I've been defending is the idea that the woman has these marks of unconditional commitment to this past relationship, the man from Germany, and how that was identity defining for her. Now, that could have made her a knight of faith, or it could have made her a knight of resignation. What I don't think it all makes her is a tragic hero. So what I want to have you ask, let's say if we're going to imagine that she is a knight of resignation, what would be the worst thing possible for someone who is a knight of resignation? Like if this is a real character, what is the deepest kind of threat a knight of resignation could face? What would Kierkegaard say? Okay, I mean, and this is not a rhetorical question. I really mean, like, pause your videos and think about it. What would be most devastating for a knight of resignation? Okay, here's a couple of thoughts. So that's your last chance to stop your videos. In many ways, a knight of resignation for Kierkegaard has a kind of imperviousness to harm. By putting one's faith in the afterlife, one has insulated oneself from the temporal risk, and by having this infinite significance in the eternal hereafter. But that doesn't mean one couldn't possibly face danger. Like think about the lover or the family member who has lost somebody and who thinks about them as being secured in the memory or the idea of them, or the lad and the princess for Kierkegaard when he tells it in terms of resignation, where the knight or the lad loves the eternal idea of the princess, and that's enough. And now he's not at temporal risk for whether or not the relationship really will happen in reality, because he's got the idea of it forever. Well, of course, forgetfulness, losing the idea, we're still human. He could forget, he could not devote himself to that in the right way. The memory or the thought of the princess could fade. So that kind of memory loss is precisely what would be devastating. And so she, the woman from Nevers, repeats this theme over and over again. She says, "You're destroying me." What could that possibly mean, except that her identity is still caught up with the past relationship of the man from Germany, not her current family who's living in France back there? See, if her current meaning of her, if the meaning of her current relationship were that significant, then the only thing that could truly destroy her would be, running off with the man from Hiroshima and forgetting them. But that's why it's not threatening. It's the fact that she is forgetting the man from Germany. That's what is so deeply threatening. The other possible danger is that this new intimacy could somehow challenge the meaning of the old one, or the idea of it, the memory of it. And that's precisely what we see in, for example, this bathroom scene where her image is doubled in this self-reflective gaze, where she talks about, it's almost like she's talking about like cheating, but she's cheating on the memory of the man from Germany. It's not that she's cheating on her current family back in France. So these are the reasons. I think this is exactly shows why she is clearly a knight of resignation. It's not just all the things that set up previously where she had this unconditional commitment, and then it was this cataclysmic loss for her, and she went through this process of grieving. She has woven her own shirt of tears, which gives her this kind of imperviousness. She is safe from harm as long as she can keep that meaning of the past with her. And the reason why the man from Hiroshima is threatening for her is because he's threatening to change that meaning. That if she could live again, if she could live in the present again, return to the temporal and finitude, then she couldn't have died. She couldn't be a knight of resignation still. She would either have to totally change and become a lower nature, like a butterfly forgetting who she is, or she would have to become a knight of faith who could live in the temporal again. But this is what she flees from and resists. And that's why the ending of the film is so deeply significant, because she has this fundamental existential choice. She can go with the man from Hiroshima, or she could flee. That she is living on an existential razor's edge. And it's by those decisions that she makes that she finally seals her fate. So that's why I think the woman from Nevers is just an amazingly deeply Kierkegaardian character, and she is like the knight of resignation par excellence, in my opinion. Okay, thanks.